to Safe Inside, brought to you by TheraTribe. I'm Jeremy Loomis, and these are my conversations with Sandra Fields, an LPC and certified clinical trauma treatment provider with over 35 years' experience helping people who have been through trauma. Welcome back to the TheraTribe podcast. I'm Jeremy.
I'm Sandy.
Last time we talked some about attachment styles and attunement. This week we're talking about the hidden epidemic of developmental trauma. Sandy, where do we begin?
Well, I think we're going to just start back with trauma where we keep going, right? The last few episodes, we talked about attachment and attunement and what can happen when things go wrong. But this time, I think we're going to go back to trauma specifically and kind of hang out there a little bit today. So I do want to say that trauma it's pretty ubiquitous in human experience.
May not always know how to call it out by its name, but it's a pretty common thing to experience.
It's pretty common. I think, of course, since the beginning of time, it's always been common. But it's seen but unseen. We sort of see it, but we pretend that we don't. And so it's kind of odd that it's one of those things that's all throughout society, and yet we all act like it's not happening. It has a wake. It's like it moves through this water, and it has a wake. It has a primary victim who moves kind of through the water. And from that, other people are impacted. So it has this wake following the event of the trauma itself.
I know for myself, that is an analogy that works for me because of my experience kayaking.
Yeah, it's the same kind of thing. So your kayak moves through and it leaves the wake behind. And the longer the wake goes, the larger it gets. If you can imagine that in your mind, it looks kind of like a triangle or an arrowhead that way. Trauma is cross-generational and it's intergenerational. And that means that it goes across generations, but then it's within the generations also. And it touches almost everyone at one time or another. It's hard to get through this life without at least a little bit of trauma coming through life. So I do want to say that trauma studies have traditionally and historically not really adequately moved from the studies to real life, right? To regular people. We hear about it a little bit more today, but not as much as it might be good to hear.
Is that to say that we'll hear about it almost like a statistic that's easy to remain detached from?
I think so. I think most people like to pretend that it's not happening. For instance, we like to pretend in some ways that not as many children are being sexually abused as they are. If we have to say that they are, then we actually have to do something about it. And it makes it hard for us. And so it's one of those things that we kind of put to the side. I also think that we don't really recognize as much trauma as there happens to be. A basic one might be a 6-year-old girl being bullied by a bunch of boys who are pulling her hair and pinching her and all of that. And people will say things like, well, their boys will be boys, or they like you, and yet that little girl is being traumatized sometimes.
Sure.
Pass through that. There's a lot of shame and taboo around it. Incest, if you are an incest victim and you speak up, people put a lot of shame on you as if you had done something taboo or that you had been responsible for doing something dirty or shameful, when it really wasn't anything that you did. It was something that someone else perpetrated upon you. We also don't like to think about it as happening to us. It's a scary thought to think that trauma might happen to us. So it always happens to other people. And so we do that. And then there's a way that in order to separate ourselves and feel comfortable, we might even blame the victim. For instance, it might be, well, if you weren't at Walmart after dark, or if you were wearing more modest clothing. And it's a way of distancing ourselves to feel safer. So trauma is something that we don't talk about, and yet it's definitely needed. Now that's changing, and people are starting to talk about it, starting to recognize it, but we still need a major education around that in the general population. So we've talked about in our other episodes, we've talked about some of the effects of trauma. We talked about the neurobiology of trauma, but we haven't really talked about the types of trauma. So there are a lot of different types of trauma. There is impersonal, and that kind of trauma has nothing to do with other people enacting on you. It's an act of God, per se. It's weather, so maybe a tornado comes through your house, transportation, maybe you're in a car accident, some kind of medical, you have a medical trauma, or you get injury, things like that. There is interpersonal, and this is trauma that's relational or attachment. We've talked about that. We've talked about the insecure trauma or attachment caused from that trauma bond. And that interpersonal also is where we think of abuse, physical or sexual, emotional. We think of assault. We think of victimization, exploitation, neglect, those kinds of things. There's a third type of trauma called lifelong trauma. And this is when you start your life in a trauma situation and your trauma continues to happen throughout your lifetime, and it kind of piles up. There is an identity type of trauma, and that's when your gender can be a problem. Ethnic and cultural identity, sexual orientation can also cause trauma, specific trauma. And then there's the fifth type is called community trauma. And this is around persecuted religious groups, for instance, or community groups, ethnicity, that kind of thing. One person can have one or many of those different types of trauma, depending on what's going on with that. Some traumas are more complex than others. So we have, if I had no trauma and I was in a car accident, that had been my only trauma, that would not be very complex. But if I were born a woman in a country where women are second-class citizens and had to hide, and they had no rights, at the same time, I was being sexually abused by my uncle. At the same time, my father physically abused me. And then I married a man who also physically abused me and neglected me. I could have all of those types, and my trauma would be more complex. There would be a lot of different factors going into that.
Just as like a point of reference, I'm thinking about how when I worked at a treatment center, one of the things that we try to gauge is whether you're in a treatment center or out of it, you try to gauge, is there a substance abuse problem? Because we kind of have to treat that before we can be sure we're seeing the rest of the situation clearly to even begin with that. So what is it like trying to peel back the layers or untangle the tangle when it's something like this?
It's actually really hard because, whatever treatment you're doing, how do you pull out which one to start with? And that's actually a clinical judgment to some degree. Typically, when I do something like EMDR, for instance, I have already worked with a client. I guess the first thing that I do actually is to help the client learn skills to help stabilize them. So it may be coping skills, relational skills, those things, because if you have that series of complex trauma events, you don't have many skills. And so helping them do that, get a support system that's stable and healthy before we do any of the actual trauma work. It may be that I'll work with a client a year or two, depending on how complex their trauma is, before we actually can get to the actual trauma, because they may not be stable enough to do that.
Build some self-efficacy, a little confidence.
Quite a bit of that, actually. And then once we do that, then I might, if I'm doing something like EMDR, depends on which trauma treatment I start with. But what I want to do is bring up some of the activation of the trauma a little bit at a time, and then integrate those coping skills to help calm them down, so that I'm constantly escalating and then calming down a client. With EMDR, it's a little bit different. I will actually, once we get to that, and I don't ever do that first thing, it's part of all the other things that I do. But when I do get to EMDR, I typically ask them to start with their first and or worst memory. But that, again, is a reason for which we may talk about in another episode, I think.
I wonder if if it could benefit some people whose ears maybe just perked up when they heard about being purposefully escalated and then calmed. Is that as scary a process as it sounds?
I think it's not as scary. By the time that the client gets there, they're ready for that. And we start a little bit at a time. It's kind of like when I talk to clients, I talk to them about when they go swimming. When I go into a lake, I'm not the type of person that's going to jump into a cold lake. I don't want that shock. So what I do is I put my toes in the lake and I wait a minute till my toes get adjusted. Then I step all the way into my ankles. And then, it'll get adjusted after a while. I'll step into my knees. Again, same thing. It'll become adjusted to the water. And then eventually I can be all the way in. I do the same thing with the trauma work. So we go in with the toes, then we calm down a little bit and we get adjusted. Then we step in a little bit further. And I follow the client's lead on that. Trauma treatment I see it as a dance, and the client leads always. And so it's this back and forth a little bit. But by the time we get there, they're usually okay with it. And it seems to be a normal, natural progression for the treatment. So yeah, it's a good question. But rarely are they scared about going there by the time we get there. They're like, okay, I'm ready now. So that's part of treatment, though, preparing the client for that.
And I think clients will generally know pretty early on, and likely will even be told straight up to be vocal about it if at any point where they're going deeper than they're ready to go.
Oh yeah. And there's a lot of signs. So we both monitor that, myself and the client.
Sure.
Most clients are afraid to come to therapy because they think we're going to jump into the trauma right away. And a good trauma therapist is not going to do that. Again, they're going to make sure that they're stable and they have the supports, internal and external, that they need, and that the client is also ready to go. So yeah, it's a good question. Thinking about that, the hidden epidemic, we do know that the younger the child, the more vulnerable they are to trauma and abuse. And we know that the more that trauma is repeated, the more that it's chronic, the more severe it is, the more prolonged it is. We know that the deeper the trauma response is going further, which makes sense. It's dose responsive, right?
When you said about lifelong trauma, does that generally show up as just staying in a destructive relationship, or is it often more just finding that no matter where you go or who you turn to next, you're just seemingly recreating the same situations?
Well, I think it's both. I think that as a child, you grow up with developmental trauma. You have parents who beat you, and you may be sexually abused growing up. When you become a teenager, more likely you are going to be sexually promiscuous as part of the trauma response. And so you are putting yourself out in situations that are risky. And eventually you most likely will marry someone who is also abusive. As I tell my clients, we date at the level of our self-esteem. And we also tend to choose partners that are the most like the parent with which we have had the most conflict. It's an innate desire to continue to work out that relationship. It's also a reenactment of our trauma, because if you've listened to the earlier podcast episodes, I talked about being stuck in time in the trauma. And so we reenact our trauma over and over again. We can see that very clearly in children. If a child has been sexually abused, they might reenact sex scenes with other kids or with their stuffed animals. And we're like, what's going on with this? Why are they doing that? Well, probably because they're reenacting their trauma.
I heard of the same thing with like reenacting kidnapping with like your doll or something like that.
Yes, like that. Only what happens is we choose partners who are very similar to our abusers, still trying to work through that. We're reenacting our trauma over and over again. And because we also choose risky behavior, that puts us more vulnerable to be victimized, re-victimized. If you are victimized, you are many times more likely to be re-victimized. Part of trauma treatment is enhancing safety. That is an actual component of trauma treatment. And so it's important to remember that we can have lifelong trauma. And if our parents use drugs, we are more likely to use substances. And then that puts us into that lifestyle where then again, we're more vulnerable for victimization than if not. So, and also a lifelong, if you grow up with developmental trauma, you don't have the skills to set really healthy boundaries. And so that also is another factor that makes you more vulnerable for more re-victimization. There's a lot of factors that play
Yeah.
into that.
Yeah. It sounds like a lot to pick apart.
It is, and it can be very layered, the trauma, and it's cumulative as we go along. And so, we have to remember that many times these victims are blamed and they're shamed, they're isolated. We blame them for this.
Do you think that this type of trauma makes it harder to reach out when somebody says, well, you should talk to someone?
I think it does. I think the shame around that really, even our movies that we watch, we should be strong and we should keep that from happening. And in most cases, the power differential is so great that you can't, until you've learned through a lifetime of this, that maybe then the power differential isn't so great, but you don't know how to protect yourself. So I do think that there's that. And I think that our culture has a lot of myths and kind of underlying beliefs. Like, we believe that children have a special protected status, that everyone takes good care of kids are kids and we all take care of them. Everybody loves kids, right? And so if you're a kid who was abused and then grew up, the internal response is, why wasn't I in that special protected class? And the answer is always going to be, because there's something wrong with me, because I am a bad person. And so they take that on, but we know that that's actually myth. Children are not more protected in our society. They are smaller human beings. They have no power. They have no resources. They can't think like an adult. They can't move physically like an adult. They are dependent on adult, and they're very accessible. So they're actually very victimized. We just don't talk about that in our society. 1 in 3 girls, 1 in 5 boys will be sexually assaulted before they're 18. 1 in 3 girls, 1 in 5 boys before they're 18, sexually assaulted. Now, that's not talking about physical assault, not talking about emotional abuse. It's not talking about neglect. It's literally talking about sexual assault. And again, we're not talking about a small child with a small child playing doctor. We're talking about a sexual assault. 1 in 3 and 1 in 5.
That's a lot of kids.
It's a lot of kids. And it's a lot of adults out here who have been sexually assaulted as children. And they keep that secret. Most don't tell. So it's because there's a lot of shame around that. And so they don't tell, and they don't get the help that they need. There's also some other factors around that we might talk about some other time, like trauma bonding, things like that.
Probably deserves its own episode.
I think it deserves probably several episodes.
Yeah.
It's a hard thing to talk about, and I hear trauma bonding being thrown out differently than what it means, but we'll talk about it some other time.
So it's a good thing to be conversationally aware of.
I think so. I do. I think, and I think also with the kids, there are several domains of impairment. It's like different areas in the kids' lives that help kind of layer into that severe trauma response that they have. We talked about the attachment trauma in a previous episode. There's biological trauma. So their biology, it can even be that their mothers have been traumatized and passed some of that down through epigenetics. We talked about the inability to control, regulate their emotions and their moods. We talked about dissociation and disconnecting from themselves and their experiences. Kids who have been traumatized and they grow up sometimes struggle with behavioral control as well. And thinking is skewed and distorted, as it would be, right? And their self-concept is totally destroyed by that time. So it's possible to come back from that and to be healed from that, but it does take some time and effort. But it is taking a lot of our resources. We're looking at a lot of people in our jails and our welfare systems. We're seeing a lot of people. If you have more than 6 adverse childhood experiences, which is another episode, I'm sure, but
you may or may not have heard of ACEs. Adverse childhood experiences. Definitely worth looking up. Whose TED Talk was it? I forget her name.
Dr. Nadine Burke Harris.
Yeah, that's very good. But we'll also definitely have content to share at some point about that subject.
Yes, if you have 6 or more ACEs, you're more likely to have 5 marriages in your life because of the relationship damage that it does. unless you get help and heal that. That's just one of the many ways that it impacts our society and our children and our families. But going through all of that and me saying 1 in 3, 1 in 5, and these are some things, none of that actually can do justice to the private reactions of individual trauma survivors. There's no way of saying how challenging it is for those trauma survivors and then their loved ones in the wake of that trauma event.
And I mentioned this too. Sometimes we do get a sense of what's normal or not based on what is freely and openly observable. And,
Mhm.
we already talked a little bit about what we can see in entertainment. One thing that stands out to me now more than ever in entertainment, it, not just the fact that in chick flicks they know each other for all of 2 days before they're ready to spend the rest of their life
Right,
together.
right.
Because how else are you going to tell a story
Yes,
that's confined to a movie? But also, I mean, how many car chases have we seen that people literally in real life would not survive, and then they come out without even a limp? There's so much we see people being resilient on a superhuman level in
yes,
movies that
yes.
we kind of think, I don't know that we think so overtly, but we kind of come away with the idea that, like, oh, this isn't a big deal. Just shake it off. Don't
Right.
make a big deal out of something that's not.
Yeah, I mean, even think about the Marvel movies. We have Black Widow. She has no superpowers, none. She is a human person who just have a long series of trainings. She is a trained assassin. That is her superpower. But you watch these movies and she jumps out of airplanes, not with a parachute. She jumps from truck to truck. She's hit by like, big superhero guys and with weapons, and she just gets up and kind of, okay, let's fight again. I'm like,
and her
goodness.
hair, and her hair probably
Oh yeah,
stays
her hair always
immaculate.
stays. I do like the fact that in one of the Marvel movies, the Black Widow movies, her sister makes fun of her fighting pose. That's
Oh
actually
yeah,
a good scene because she like flips her hair and it's
yeah.
actually really cool.
I
But
like that.
I do like the Marvel movies, but she isn't even superhuman. And yet she goes through all of these things and is able to just get up. And, it doesn't matter. Clint, who also is Hawkeye, same thing. He's good with the bow and arrow, but you watch him in these movies and you're like, how in the world did he survive that?
Yeah,
And then he got up and was like, okay, I'm running again. And I'm like, I'd be dead. If I wasn't dead, I'd be in intensive care. So yeah, I think it puts an unrealistic expectation on our responsibility and our ability, even our capacity to be resilient and bounce back from a severe trauma. Because it is just that, it's trauma. It affects us biologically and emotionally. And those two interact back and forth together,
Mm.
the emotions and the biology. And we can come up with a lot of problems with from that, which we've talked about. We will continue to talk about as we go along. Remember that trauma is the gateway drug. Literally, they used to talk about marijuana being the gateway drug. Well, the truth is, trauma is the gateway drug. Trauma is the gateway to homelessness. Trauma, most times or many times, is the gateway to suicidality.
Mm.
Trauma is the gateway to self harm, cutting and burning yourself. It's the self harm. I mean, it can be the gateway to OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, other compulsions, can be a gateway to eating disorders, a gateway to risk taking. All of these things there's strong correlations between these particular things and childhood trauma. Um, Medical treatment, many times people with trauma, they overwhelm the medical facilities. For instance, people with borderline personality disorder, you may or may not know this, but they take up 40% of the inpatient psychiatric reserves across the United States. 40% for only borderline personality disorder. Knowing that the etiology of borderline personality disorder is attachment trauma and usually early sexual trauma, we know this. They take up 40% of our inpatient funds and spaces and resources across the United States. They're not that big part of the population, but they're not able to function well enough and they take up those many resources. Um, We have a lot of illnesses, underactive thyroid, asthma, chronic heart disease, diabetes, all of the obesity. These things are directly correlated to adverse childhood experiences or early childhood trauma.
Mm.
So, early death. If you have, we'll talk about the ACEs, but if you have six or more, just six or more of the adverse childhood experiences. So, if you have a parent that has mental health issues, or your parents got divorced, you were neglected, you were sexually abused. I'm just counting a few of them. If you, just two more, my brain went blank. Just two more. If you have a family member that went to jail, and maybe if you have a family member that's addicted to drugs, if you have those, your lifespan is most likely 20 years less. People with childhood trauma swamp our medical resources because they have so many medical issues that we're not paying attention to. It's crazy when we think about the statistics around that.
Yeah.
Our psychiatric facilities, our behavioral health, our counselors, we see a lot of people with complex trauma, but they come in for other things. They have headaches, they have, strokes, they have all of these things, and they're there, and our resources are having to be there. They're not able to take care of themselves and keep a job, many of them, and so they are having to use our welfare services. Again, I love that we have a safety net. I think we should have that. I'm not saying that, but I'm wondering if we saw that there was this huge amount of people who were suffering from this type of trauma, and it was causing us to use all of these resources, but in a way that doesn't actually solve the root of the issue. We're going to keep throwing this money and our resources at this and still not ease their suffering. And it continues to be a strain on our society. I wonder what would happen if we looked at it differently. What if we started addressing adverse childhood experiences? What if we, instead of just seeing but pretending we didn't see trauma, we actually saw trauma? What if we started changing our society and no longer saying boys will be boys and that little boy picking on you, he just likes you? What if we said it's unacceptable for someone to hurt you and we validated that?
And taught accountability.
And then what if we taught all of our kids maybe how to regulate emotion, how to shake off trauma? And I say shake off trauma, not in
the pretend it didn't happen,
but in a somatic way,
sure,
or in a therapeutic way, right? What if we taught them how to do these things? What if we taught our adults? I wonder if we took some of those resources and put it at that, if we would actually use less resources in the long run.
Growing well instead of just focusing on damage control.
Yes, exactly. Those are the thoughts that I have day after day.
Yeah.
When I see so many people that have complex trauma, and I'm thinking, what if we could just take these resources and change the way that we are approaching how we handle that, instead of waiting till they get, severe heart disease. If we, intervened with some kind of therapeutic methods way earlier, maybe they wouldn't get heart disease and they would live longer.
And it's if you're hearing some of these things for maybe the first time, I think you're going to find, like I've found, that the pieces of the puzzle have been there. It just maybe it hasn't been abundantly obvious how the dots all connect, and it becomes more and more clear how the human machine is a complex thing to keep in balance.
Right.
And like we've talked in previous episodes about the mind-body connection, you can't do all the right things physically and still expect to be okay if the mental and emotional health is just out the window.
Right, exactly. They all impact. And so we can't do that without a major thought. We can't change. It is a hidden epidemic. And we really do need to shine some light on it and change that word from hidden to isn't, just get rid of it. And this is an epidemic that we need to address.
Something you said toward the beginning of today's episode, it sounded like it's a very strong draw to not acknowledge a thing when that thing feels like more than you're prepared to handle.
Yeah, I think so. I think that collectively we lack the skills or the coping strategies to handle the amount of trauma that is in our society. But what happens when we ignore those kinds of things? They're there. We're dragging it around. When we ignore it, it becomes more and more barbarous day after day, and bigger and darker and hairier and just, more and more evil almost, right? And so if we don't acknowledge it, if we don't find the courage to face this, then it's going to continue to get worse and worse because it's going to continue to become more barbarous as time goes on.
Sobering one today.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry,
no.
not sorry.
Yeah. No, because we have to face it. So,
Yeah. Sorry,
I
not
mean,
sorry.
I mean, it's a lot better than continuing to basically be an entire generation of the blind leading the blind over a
Right.
cliff.
Right. It's one of those things we talked earlier about rupture and repair. And around the trauma response or our response to the trauma in our nation, we really do need a huge rupture and repair. We need to rupture that open, face that, and then fix it, and no longer pretend that it's not happening.
So if we're going to do that, we're going to have to do it together.
Yes. Yes.
So we're glad, whoever you are, that you're listening right now or watching right now. Any final thoughts before we wrap this one up?
Other than, honestly, it was a sobering thought. These are statistics that I carry all the time. However, I also know that there are a lot of people, there is somewhat of a movement in that direction. I can remember 20 years ago working in trauma and not hearing about it from anyone.
Now there's kids who are activists for this stuff.
Yes, I mean, people at least know they hear it. It's not fully out there yet, but I see a movement. So if you see the movement, join it. The more the merrier, actually, the more we're going to need. We're going to need you all. So join it all. But I do see a movement in that direction. So we'll stay somewhat hopeful and continue to push forward. And maybe the newer generations coming up, as I'm aging out, will be able to push it on over that cliff into that actual repair process.
Normalize healing.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Thanks for being here with us. We'll talk soon.
Thank you.